When people today think of William Wallace, the Scottish freedom fighter, they often imagine Mel Gibson's version from the film Braveheart, a man who stood up against English oppression, crying freedom before his death. The reality of Wallace's capture and execution in London in 1305 was far darker, crueler, and more gruesome than most people realise. His death was not simply an execution, it was a carefully staged public display of power and terror. To witness this in person would have been a shocking, unforgettable, and even traumatising experience. William Wallace had become a symbol of resistance during the First War of Scottish Independence. Born around 1270, he rose from obscurity to lead guerrilla attacks against the occupying English forces of King Edward I. His most famous victory came in 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where his smaller forces destroyed a much larger English army. But fortunes changed. In 1298, Wallace was defeated at Falkirk and eventually resigned as Guardian of Scotland. Still, he did not disappear. For years he carried on the fight, becoming a wanted man across the British Isles. To the English crown he was not a noble opponent, but a dangerous outlaw, branded a traitor and murderer. In August 1305, Wallace was finally captured near Glasgow, betrayed by a Scottish knight named John de Menteith. He was transported under heavy guard to London, where Edward I intended to make an example of him. For ordinary Londoners, the arrival of this notorious rebel was big news. Crowds lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the man they had heard about in royal proclamations. Many believed him to be a barbarian, a criminal, even a savage, and few in London saw him as a freedom fighter. To understand Wallace's execution, it is important to know how medieval justice worked. Executions in the 13th and 14th centuries were not hidden events. They were public, dramatic performances meant to reinforce the authority of the king. The punishment reserved for treason, the crime Wallace was accused of, was especially horrific: hanging, drawing, and quartering. This was not a single method of execution, but a sequence of degrading tortures designed to humiliate, break, and erase the criminal. Those in the crowd would have known they were about to see something extraordinary. The streets of London were packed with onlookers, not only common townsfolk, but also nobles, officials, and soldiers. Attendance was not optional for some, being there demonstrated loyalty to the king, and for others it was grim entertainment in a time before theatres and mass media. But the brutality that awaited Wallace shocked even hardened medieval eyes. On the morning of August 23rd, 1305, Wallace was dragged from the Tower of London. He was stripped and bound, then tied to a hurdle, a wooden panel pulled behind horses. This humiliating mode of transport scraped his body against the filth of the streets as he was paraded through the city. The procession route was long, winding from the Tower through London Bridge and into Smithfield, the traditional site for executions. Londoners crowded every inch of the path, jeering, throwing insults, and in some cases pelting him with litter. To them this was not just punishment, but also theatre. Imagine standing in that crowd, the stench of unwashed bodies, the heat of the August sun, the cries of vendors selling food, the clamour of horses' hooves. At the centre, the broken figure of Wallace, tied down and helpless, his hair matted, his face grim but defiant. The parade itself lasted hours, giving everyone a chance to see him reduced from rebel leader to condemned criminal. When Wallace reached Smithfield, he was placed before the royal justices. His crimes were read aloud: treason, robbery, arson, and the killing of civilians during the Scottish Wars. The charge of treason was particularly pointed, for Wallace argued he owed no allegiance to Edward I, he had never sworn loyalty to him. But legal niceties mattered little. The sentence had already been decided. He would suffer the full traitor's death, drawn, hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. For the crowd, the anticipation reached its peak. Few had ever witnessed a complete ritual of this punishment, and it was considered the ultimate form of justice. Wallace was first hanged. He was strung up on a wooden gallows before the roaring crowd. But unlike a modern execution by hanging, this was not meant to be quick or merciful. He was lifted until the rope strangled him, but he was then cut down before death. The gasping, choking Wallace was left half alive, wheezing for breath, while the crowd pressed closer. Witnessing such a scene was disturbing, the human body convulsing, legs kicking wildly, then collapsing as air was restored. It was both horrifying and mesmerising. People in the crowd may have felt both revulsion and fascination, knowing they were watching something extraordinary. Next came the most gruesome stage, disembowelment. Wallace was laid on a table. Before the eyes of thousands, his executioners cut open his abdomen and pulled out his intestines. They burned them before him as he clung on to life still. This was the point where the reality of medieval justice became unbearable for many spectators. The smell of blood and burning flesh filled the air. The cries, or perhaps only the faint groans of the dying man, echoed across the square. Children may have screamed, women fainted, but others cheered, hungry for more. What makes Wallace's death even worse to imagine is that it was deliberately drawn out. The purpose was not simply to kill but to degrade, to destroy his body while he remained aware of what was happening. Finally, when Wallace could endure no more, he was beheaded. His head was severed from his body in one stroke, but even in death the punishment continued. The executioners hacked his body into 4 pieces, known as quarters. His limbs were separated, each dripping with blood, then packed to be displayed across England and Scotland. Wallace's head was put on a spike on London Bridge, as a warning to anyone crossing the Thames that this was the fate of traitors. His quarters were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth, towns symbolic of his rebellion. For the crowd the spectacle ended there. They had witnessed not just a killing, but a full destruction of a human body in the name of the king. So why was this execution worse than we think? Several reasons stand out. Firstly, the prolonged nature of the torture. Unlike a swift death, Wallace's ordeal lasted for hours. From the parade through London to the half-hanging to the disembowelment, the crowd saw a man slowly broken down. Also the sights, sounds and smells. Medieval executions were not sanitised. The blood, the smoke from the burning entrails, the cries of the condemned, all were vividly real. No medieval audience was shielded from the physical reality of the violence. Also, the forced participation of the crowd. Being there was part of a ritual. To show loyalty to the king, Londoners were expected to watch, to cheer and to take lessons to heart. Refusing to attend or sympathising with the condemned could be dangerous. But there was also a message of fear. This was not just about Wallace, it was about every rebel, every dissenter. Watching his death was meant to frighten the crowd into submission, reminding them of the king's total power. Ironically, Edward I's attempt to erase William Wallace's legacy had the opposite effect. Though his body was destroyed, his memory grew. In Scotland, Wallace became a martyr for independence, his death a rallying cry rather than a warning. For centuries, ballads, poems and chronicles kept his story alive. Today, the Wallace Monument in Stirling honours his memory, while the grim details of his execution remind us of the cruelty of medieval justice. For the Londoners who saw it firsthand in 1305, it was an experience unlike any other. They had witnessed the total destruction of a man, physically, emotionally and symbolically. It was worse than any film, worse than any legend, and far worse than any people could ever imagine. The execution of William Wallace in 1305 was not a simple matter of killing a rebel. It was a staged performance of power, cruelty and fear. To witness it in person meant being confronted with the full brutality of medieval justice, hours of torment, humiliation and bloody dismemberment. When modern people think of Wallace, they may picture a noble hero shouting freedom on the scaffold, but the truth is that his death was far darker and far more horrifying. It was designed to shock, to scar and to intimidate, and for those who stood in the crowd that day, watching William Wallace die was far worse than you would think. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.